In the summer of 1977, a man on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state decided his farm needed a pond. He hired a backhoe, started scooping out a low wet corner of his field, and about 6 feet down the bucket came up with two enormous curved tusks hanging off it. That was strange enough, but somewhere in the bones underneath was a single rib with something buried inside it, and that rib would sit in a storage room for 30 years while the man who found it was quietly written off as mistaken. His name was Emanuel, and everybody called him Manny. He was retired. He farmed a piece of land just outside the town of Sequim, and by every account he was the sort of person who did the right thing immediately and without fuss. Because when those tusks came out of the ground, he did not keep them, he did not sell them, he stopped the digging and got on the phone to Washington State University. A zoo archaeologist named Carl Gustafson drove out to look, and what he found was a mastodon, buried in the fine sediment of an old pond bed that had been quietly preserving it since the end of the last ice age. Gustafson would spend the next 2 summers excavating that field. It is worth knowing what a mastodon actually is, because most people file them alongside mammoths, and they were not the same animal at all. Mammoths were grazers, open grassland animals, tall at the shoulder with high domed heads. Mastodons were shorter, heavier, built low to the ground, and they lived in forest and wetland, browsing on branches and shrubs. The teeth are the giveaway. A mammoth tooth is a great ridged grinding plate built for chewing grass. A mastodon tooth has blunt cone-shaped cusps built for crushing wood. 2 enormous animals sharing a continent and eating completely different things. And the ground that had been holding this one was almost perfect for the job. The corner of field Manny had picked for his pond was the remains of an old kettle pond, a hollow left behind by retreating ice, which had slowly filled with fine waterlogged sediment, wet, airless, undisturbed. The kind of ground where bone does not rot, it waits. And in among the bones was the rib. The rib had something embedded in it, something sharp, driven in at an angle, deep into the bone, and around that object the bone had grown. That detail is the entire story, so it is worth slowing down on. When a living animal is injured and survives, the bone reacts. It swells, it remodels, it tries to seal the wound. Dead bone does not do that. So the growth around that object meant the mastodon had been alive when it happened, had walked away from it, and had lived long enough afterward for its body to begin healing over whatever was stuck in its side. Something had attacked this animal and failed to kill it. Then the dates came back and they landed at roughly 13,800 years ago. At that moment, the rule in American archaeology was absolute. The first people on the continent were the Clovis hunters, arriving about 13,000 years ago, carrying a very particular fluted stone spear point. This was several hundred years too early, and the object in the rib was not stone at all. It was bone. Gustafson published what he had found, and the response was not outrage exactly. It was something quieter, and in some ways harder to fight. It was doubt, because there was an obvious alternative explanation, and it was a good one. Mastodons are enormous animals living in a landscape full of other enormous animals. They fall, they fight, they are struck by tusks. A splinter of bone driven into a rib during a collision would look from the outside very much like a weapon driven into a rib by a hunter. Sharp bone fragment goes in, animal survives, bone grows around it. Same result, no people required. And critically, nobody could see inside the rib. The imaging available at the end of the 1970s simply could not resolve the shape of the object well enough to say whether it had been carved or broken. So it sat there, not disproved, just unproven, which in science is often a worse place to be. I find this the most frustrating part of the whole story, and it is worth being precise about why. The skeptics were not being unreasonable, they were being correct. The evidence in front of them genuinely was not good enough. The answer was sitting inside that rib the entire time, and it was nobody's fault that the tools to look at it did not exist yet. Carl Gustafson carried the site for the next 3 decades. He kept arguing for it, kept publishing, and largely kept being told it was interesting but not conclusive. It is easy to say 30 years. It is harder to picture what 30 years of that actually looks like. It means going to conference after conference and having the same conversation. It means holding a site that everybody in your field has heard of and nobody quite believes. It means watching the best thing you ever found slowly become a thing people are polite about. Manny Manis never got an answer at all. He died in 2000, and then in 2011 somebody put the rib in a CT scanner. A CT scanner does not photograph a surface. It takes hundreds of thin cross-sectional slices and stacks them so you can rebuild whatever is inside an object without ever cutting into it. Point it at a mastodon rib and the bone effectively becomes transparent. A team led by the archaeologist Michael Waters ran the rib through exactly that and built the embedded object in 3 dimensions. Not a photograph, a shape, and the shape was a point, sharpened, tapered, deliberately worked into a weapon and driven into that animal, hard enough to lodge in bone. Then they went further. They extracted genetic material from the object itself and sequenced it, and the result is the detail that makes this story impossible to forget. The point was made of mastodon bone. Someone had killed a mastodon, taken a piece of it, carved that piece into a weapon, and used it to hunt another mastodon. The animal in Manny Manis's field had been speared with a tool made from its own kind. Refined dating held at around 13,800 years. The findings were published in the journal Science, and what had been a contested claim from a Washington farm field for 30 years became, more or less overnight, a data point that nobody needed to argue about. Carl Gustafsson was still alive to see it. 32 years after he first pulled that rib out of the ground, the machine finally caught up with him. The wider ground had shifted too. Monteverde in Chile had been accepted. Footprints at White Sands in New Mexico would be dated by 4 separate methods to more than 20,000 years ago. The Manis mastodon was no longer an outlier fighting a rule. It was one piece of a much older picture that had finally come into focus. What stays with me is how small the margin was. Not the margin in the dating, the margin in the finding. If Manny Manis had wanted his pond 50 feet to the left, none of this exists. If he had been the kind of man who saw 2 ivory tusks come out of his own land and thought about what they might be worth, none of this exists. He made one phone call on one afternoon, and that call's the only reason we know somebody was hunting mastodons on that peninsula before the people we were told came first. He never found out he was right, but the rib kept the answer safe for 34 years, waiting for somebody to build a machine that could read it. Somewhere out there in a museum drawer, in a university basement, in a cardboard box nobody has opened since the 1970s, there is almost certainly another one, sitting quietly, holding the answer to something, waiting for the technology to arrive. If you found this fascinating, hit subscribe for more stories like this.